This is sort of the Grunfeld center structure, and well, basically, it's a structure that has a great reputation for both sides, so to speak. It really depends, but it's a very balanced structure in general. From White's perspective, well, it's obvious, right? We have these two central strong pawns, and while Black is trying to undermine it, we have the backup here, which basically means that we keep our center intact. As we will see, a typical strategy will be that while these pawns are, of course, nice in itself, they will have to, at some point, move forward, most likely, in order to realize sort of some kind of long-term potential. But that can be both with, let's say, d5, and we try to create sometimes a passed pawn in d file, or it can even be the move e5, and then sort of having an attack on the king side quite often. And, well, it's also that, I mean, if you look at this center, right, the control of the center while Black has the queen side means that White also has potential on the king side quite typically, while, let's say, the queen side is more in Black's domain. With other structures, it's typically, there is this idea that the pieces will flow in a certain direction. Here, it's very much depends, I would argue. I mean, for a start, well, where's the knight on b1 going? Well, most likely it has already been taken on c3, right? That's how basically, I mean, typically, well, there will be a knight taking on c3, and then this structure comes from playing b takes c3. So there's normally only maximum three minor pieces. Well, this knight would often go to f3, at least in non-Grunfeld structures. That sounds perhaps weird, but the Grunfeld structure comes from a variety of openings. It can be semitaras, it can be Queen's Indian, but generally it really, I mean, it's so typical that it's not just limited to the Grunfeld. With the actual Grunfeld, quite often the knight will actually go to e2, because on f3 there might be a problem with bishop b4, g4 happening. A very defining sort of factor of where is the white pieces going is also, is there going to be a black bishop on g7 or not? Let's say if you have played the move e6 and it comes from a Queen's Indian, then there's not going to be a bishop on g4, so we will jump to f3. So it's more difficult in this structure to sort of pinpoint exactly where is the pieces going, because, well, it's it sort of, it can come from a variety of openings, and that means the pieces will go to quite different squares. If we look at it from the Black's perspective, then, well, it's quite obvious. We have allowed a broad center, but we see the broad center as something we can undermine. So, well, typically, of course, if it's a Grunfeld, we will have a bishop standing on g7 attacking against the center. The knight will come to c6, the bishop to g5, g4, sorry, and we're going to do everything to undermine this center. Quite often, I mean, if it's a Queen's Gambit or Queen's Indian structure, we will have a pawn on e6, then our bishop will go to b7 after b6, the bishop will go to e7, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, let's say in the Grunfeld structure with the bishop on g7, a lot of it is the direct undermining of the center. While if we play it in a more, let's say, the Queen's Indian style, then it's a more solid of limiting sort of the influence of the center, perhaps controlling the d5 square, so it's more difficult for them to move forward. But generally, it's a healthy structure from both sides, and when we look at it from Black's side, it's about, well, ideally, of course, winning and undermining the center, but it could also be just sort of keeping the center at bay and making sure it can't really progress, so it becomes long-term weaknesses. But, I mean, it's an interesting structure, so I'm looking forward to discussing it with you. The first game in this Grunfeld Center chapter is a classic. It's Karpov against Kasparov from the World Championship match in 1990. Basically, Karpov and Kasparov had a sort of incredibly interesting rivalry. Of course, there was also a rivalry off the boards, and now it's sort of very much connected to politics. But generally, it was an incredibly interesting chess dispute between two players who was clearly the best in the world at the time. I mean, now, well, we're used to, for instance, having Magnus Carlsen being clearly the best, but there's no one who is sort of clearly the second best or someone who's extremely close to him in level. Karpov Kasparov was amazing in that way, that they were so obviously the two best players in the world, and they were quite equal in strength. Perhaps now we will remember Kasparov as the stronger one in their duel, and that is to some extent true. He ended up on top, but generally it was very interesting duel, both in terms of who would win, but also with so much good chess content. And I think also what made it so fascinating was that it was pre-computer time. So it was basically the two, biggest intellectuals chess-wise, and the rest of the world needed to learn from not only their games, but also what they would say. And on the contrary, it also meant, I think, some kind of special bond between these two because, basically, they were the only ones they could talk chess with on their own level. Nowadays it's so much easier because we have chess engines. For instance, I work for Magnus Carlsen, and when he plays a game, I can just switch on the engine and I get a good idea what's going on. But at that time, what should seconds do? They were just so much weaker than the players, right? So for Kasparov and Karpov, I think it was incredibly interesting to play each other, but also to analyze with each other, simply because they understood something that the rest of the world didn't. Anyway, let's look at the game they played. This is after move 21 in game 17 in the Lyon/New York World Championship match. I was 17 years old at the time, and I remember this game making a huge sort of impression on me because, look at this position. Why should white particularly be better? I guess you can argue nothing is particular is going on, but doesn't this knight just have the beautiful square on c4? That looks very nice. And also, what's so great about the white position? It was very hard for me to grasp. If anything, I would almost think, isn't black kind of better here? That black is better here is completely wrong. But, I think at the time we got this impression that white is much better here, which is not really the case, but it depends on some kind of details. But basically, I think, you can see on the author also in this book, this game made a huge impression. And, I'm not alone there. Anyway, let's have a look. First of all, Karpov's threat is taking on e7. So this has to be sort of attended to. Kasparov does it with rook e8, but this is actually a way too passive move. It's still surprising that this position is quite unpleasant for black, but it really is, and we will see later why. So the question is, what should black have done here? Active play would have been probably the best. Knight to c4. It sort of has this threat of knight to b2. Probably Kasparov was afraid that Karpov would take on e7 because if you, let's say, go knight to b2, queen d2, knight takes d1, then after bishop takes f8, white just has a healthy extra pawn. But after bishop takes e7, you can play rook e8. Now you're threatening the bishop on e7, but you're also threatening the fork on b2. White can then go bishop to a3, and after takes, rook takes e4, d5. Perhaps it looks very unpleasant with this d-pawn just sort of running down the board. But, computers indicate that, let's say, rook e8, d6, rook to d8, queen to d3, then something like queen e6. Black is actually kind of okay. Even if the pawn gets to d7, it seems to be no big deal. Let's say d7, bishop f6, and computer says this is just an equal position. I guess black will sort of start building a passed pawn here. At some point there will be a swap between d7 and the b pawn with a draw to follow. So Kasparov should have gone for activity with the knight to c4. But I think Kasparov not choosing to go for activity sounds perhaps weird, but he doesn't do it because he thinks his position is completely healthy after the move he plays. One could also mention, maybe something like, let's say, queen to b7, but then there is this move, queen a3, which attacks the knight on a5 and the pawn on e7. black is still kind of okay in stuff like this because, well, the d pawn seems not to be dangerous enough here as well. Anyway, I think the most illustrative is looking at what actually happened in the game. So Kasparov played the move rook to e8. Looks perfectly healthy, as I said. Karpov just went rook to c1, queen to b7, and d5. And it's still hard for me to really fully believe that white is better here, despite I have seen the game when it actually basically was played, and I felt this emotion. But is it really? I mean, what is it that white is doing is this attack really so dangerous? And can't the knight just jump to c4? I know the answer, but it still puzzles me, I have to admit. So Kasparov went knight to c4, and now a very nice move. Just knight to d2, basically exchanging off the knight on c4. Now Kasparov really should have played the move h6. It's at first sight perhaps hard to understand why is this so crucial, but the point is that after, let's say, bishop f4, then there is no longer pressure towards the e7 pawn. And this means you can go knight b2, and after, let's say, queen e3, you can combat the c line, like without e7 hanging. And similarly, after h6, if you go bishop to h4, then you will play knight to b2, and after queen e3, again, you will play the somewhat weakening move g5, but just in order to be able to play rook c8 to combat the c-file and not lose the pawn on e7. Kasparov, again, he just doesn't seem to feel the danger, is my impression. So he takes on d2, and after bishop takes d2, actually white is really considerably better. Well, the point is that the rook is going to enter on c6, white is going to have the c-file, and at the same time, also, this majority is very hard to get going because the bishop is quite well placed on d2. It's actually a considerable edge. Now, I think a computer says the best move is bishop e5, and after rook c6, white has quite some advantage. It could be that Kasparov has blundered the next mini tactical sequence. Kasparov played the move rook to c8, and Karpov played this very strong move rook c6. Without this move, the position would just be equal and drawish. It can sound strange that Kasparov misses a tactic while Karpov sees it, but actually, well, Kasparov is described as a calculator, while Karpov is an intuitive player. And they basically say about calculators like Kasparov that Kasparov has the ability to calculate amazing variations, calculate very far, but being of a calculating nature rather than intuitive, he might miss some small details like moves like rook c6, while someone like Karpov would feel the small tactics much better because he's intuitive, while he's not capable of calculating as far as Kasparov as all. That is very generalistic, but it is actually what happens here. Rook c6 is a brilliant move. Of course, we should see that there is a very sort of short tactical point, takes, and if queen takes c6, well, you just give a check and go bishop h6 and game over. There's going to be a mate on f8 quite soon. Of course, you can choose to sort of play queen c7 here, but after queen d7, bishop to e5, bishop to h6, there's going to be the threat of queen e8 mate. And if you take like this, then you shouldn't allow black to sort of play f6, but after e5, simply, well, the king is not able to come to the rescue of the d-pawn, and white is going to win trivially. So rook c6 probably was a very unpleasant surprise for Kasparov, and I think until here he just thought everything is fine, I'm going to make a draw, things are under control. Now his position becomes extremely unpleasant. He plays the move bishop to e5. But Karpov's next move is also brilliant. He plays bishop to c3. He's actually allowing further exchanges. But, well, if Kasparov takes on c3 and Karpov takes back, it's an extremely unpleasant position. Probably the best would be to play something like rook to e8. Well, Karpov would then play the move a3. This would completely pacify this majority, and he has the c-file, he has a passed d-pawn potentially. It's a tough defense for Kasparov. It makes sense to understand that in this position, let's say takes here, queen c7. This seems to be just a lost queen ending. White will probably start with h4, which has this intention of going h5, h6, creating mating threat. So black should play h5 himself, but now white has sort of gained some space and also a bit of luft for the king. And it turns out that, let's say, e5, a5 to get counterplay, queen c5, b4, queen to d5. This threat of queen d7 is basically winning. Let's say something like this. You just play like this, and even here, well, there is some checks, but there never seems to be perpetual. The white king will escape, and black is just dead lost. So bishop c3. I mean, again, I have this recalling I'm recalling this emotion I had in my youth that, well, is white really that much better here? But it seems to be the case that black is close to being lost. Kasparov played the move bishop to b8. Karpov threatened mate, but of course the main point is that he's creating weaknesses around the black king. So f6 is forced, and then the move bishop to a5. Again, a very short tactic of Karpov, right? If you take on c6, we take back, and if you take the pawn, it's just queen d8 and collect on b8, easily winning. So Kasparov played the move bishop to d6. Karpov took over the c file. If you take it, well, it's the usual problem. The c pawn becomes so strong. So let's say rook e8. a3 was the game. Also typical Karpov, right? Keeping everything under control. King g7 happened. g3. I guess partly the idea is to play with f4, but perhaps also just to put the king on g2 and everything is going to be safe. And somehow, well, he's gained a bit of space and he's moved the king to a white square place. So bishop e5, queen c5. Now h5 is a bad move, but it actually helps Karpov play a very instructive move. Bishop to c7. He simply, again, is willing to offer an exchange of pieces, but that will give him access to the c7 square. And if the rook comes to c7, the pawn on e7 is going to drop. Kasparov cannot allow that. So bishop a1 happened, bishop f4, and now basically rook c7 is next, and it's game over. Kasparov tried queen d7 to sort of hint that this is a threat, but Karpov ignored it because, again, if you take the pawn on h3, it's just rook e7 takes like this, and if king g8, then bishop h6 and mate on g7. So Kasparov went rook d8, queen to d8, and now d6, g5, d7, rook f8, bishop to sort of d2, bishop e5, rook b7, and Kasparov resigned. I think basically, well, the author describes that queen c6 and let's say bishop e3 to b6 is going to queen the pawn, but I think, well, more relevantly, there is no hurry, and black is just completely death. He has no kind of counterplay. So I think Karpov is more making sure that nothing moves, and then he's going to win eventually. An amazing game by Karpov, and also amazing that he is managing to win a game like this on against peak Kasparov. Because Karpov ended up as the general loser in their dispute, he probably doesn't get enough credit for how great a player he actually was at the time. I mean, that he was capable of pushing Kasparov to his limit is a huge performance. And, well, I think they are such a good fit because they were almost equally in strength, and they were quite different in style. So, well, there is a bunch of games where Kasparov is the one who, I wouldn't say humiliates Karpov, but wins in similar crushing fashion. So Karpov also got his share, and this one was a sort of, I think, a very instructive game. And, well, trying to sum up, well, we get to understand the strategic danger of this Grunfeld center. I mean, a lot is connected to the D pawn. I think Jonathan Browson has sort of even made a chapter or two in a book, basically trying to, well, show the strength of this D pawn. And I think Karpov did it in a clever way, but especially by taking over the C file. It still makes a huge impression on me how he first, offers the exchange of knights to make the position sort of more clarified. And even later, he offers the exchange of bishops. I mean, Karpov is using exchanges not in a way to equalize. But no, he's using exchanges to sort of remove his opponent's activity, but at the same time promoting his own trumps. And yeah, I just really like this game. I liked it in my youth. I still like it. I think it's very telling for a lot of things. So I hope you enjoy it and feel inspired too. Our next game is between Wesley So and our author Flores Rios. And I really like the way Flores Rios is sort of presenting this in the book. He's basically saying that, sure, here I am. I thought I was just exchanging off stuff and quite easily making a draw. I mean, I should be very close to equal in this position. But then, well, he says that, well, to be honest, I didn't know the game I have just showed you previously with Karpov against Kasparov. So basically, my understanding was off. And you can say that, well, he's basically using himself as the prime example of, well, why you should study his book. Because if you don't know the classics, if you don't understand the structures, you simply end up losing to sort of public knowledge. And this game is a great example of that. Wesley So now plays the logical move rook to d1. Flores Rios mentions that even bishop h6 is very interesting. And, well, this exchanges even further pieces. But as we saw in the Karpov-Kasparov game, even sort of without any kind of minor pieces, this structure can still be pretty dangerous. Flores Rios says just rook c1, rook c8, and again this move rook c6, as we saw before, is considerably better for white. And I think he's right. If it's better than what Wesley So played, is a different thing. But the point is that either white gets the c-file, or black will have to exchange on c6 and give this passed pawn. And, well, again, let's just take this example here. Why is white clearly better here? Well, obviously, it's due to the c-pawn, but quite often in such position, black can just start creating a passed pawn, and eventually this passed pawn will lead to an exchange against the stronger white passed pawn like this. But here, well, we can see that these pawns are very, very well blockaded. So basically, it's gonna end up with passive defense with black, and if that's holdable or not, it's hard to say, but it's extremely unpleasant. And, you know, that means that, well, in this position, there's nothing you can do. Next is going to be rook f to c1. And, well, basically, it's a choice between giving the c-file or getting this passed pawn. So bishop h6 would actually have been pretty cool. But So played rook d1, which is also a very, very reasonable move. Flores went back to g7 and probably thought everything was going quite well still. But after bishop a3, he starts sort of feeling that actually it's quite dangerous. The main point is that, well, white just wants to go e4 and e5 and d6 and create this strong passed pawn that's going to be, well, very pacifying for the black position. He thought that, say, maybe after queen d7, e5, there's not much you can do except just waiting passively. And he gives a line like this, and then maybe, well, he says g3 to prepare f4, but I think, well, most moves are quite nice here. But g3 I like, not necessarily only to play the move f4, as the author says, but also just to have the nice square for my king on g2, and maybe I could later play h4. But basically, g3 is just improving the white position. And he goes on something like this, the usual, and it becomes a sort of, should you give white the c-file, or should you allow exchanges, which perhaps means the passed pawn will be even stronger. It becomes a sort of, I would say, artificial debate if white is much better or winning or not here. It's obviously very pleasant for white to play. So Flores decided that he needed to stop these pawns, and he somehow, well, transferred the bishop back to this diagonal. But So just went on rook c1, queen d7, and rook c6, the typical thing. And here, well, again, probably passive defense is best, he says. He plays the move rook c8, queen c2, and he says here passive defense probably would be better. He says rook b8, and again this typical move g3, just improving the position. The king will go here, and yeah, it's I cannot prove that white is winning here, but on the other hand, black cannot prove it's a draw either. It's just an unpleasant scenario where black will have to defend passively and hope for the best. most players don't want to do that. So Flores Rios decided to play e6, but he says this just makes the white task easier, because let's say g3, e takes d5, e takes d5, h5. At first sight, I guess it could look like things has improved for black, right? You can argue that, well, this is now an isolated pawn that doesn't have this backup from the pawn on e4 anymore. And, well, also, I mean, the e-file for a black rook isn't that helpful. No, it's actually helpful for a white rook. And the tactics works in white's favor here. Rook e1 is a very strong move. The point is that, well, you cannot take on d5 and protect the bishop, because then c8 is going to be hanging. And it's uncomfortable to defend now. If you sort of start moving the bishop to g7, I would assume that rook e7 just basically wins instantly, right? So Rios is forced to play the move rook to e8, and then another very strong move by So. He plays the move d6. Sometimes I think if black would be able to control things, it would not necessarily be so bad. But there is an immediate threat of rook c7, and well, also I like the move g3, so there's no back-ranked threats, and this generally has this tendency that tactics works very well for white. Probably the best would be to just play bishop f6. It stops, let's say, rook to sort of e7 ideas, but white should then play the move rook to d1, basically sort of protecting this passed pawn, and rook c7 is going to come next. It's extremely unpleasant for black. Flores Rios went back rook e to c8. It can look like you are sort of yo-yoing back and forth, but well, the idea is that now he's forced to, let's say, exchange here, and after, well, you're going to take with the rook, and next move you're going to play bishop f6 and protect the e7 square. It's a very reasonable thought. But in this position, So has a very nice tactic. He plays the move rook to c7. And, well, we saw that with the pawn on d5, Karpov was doing this rook c6 tactic. So is just doing it in an even cooler way, right? He's doing it with the pawn on d6 and the rook on c7. Well, you can't take on c7, but you can't not do it. So Rios takes, the pawn takes back. And after, well, if you take with the bishop on c7, then just rook e7, and we're trivially going to connect the bishop on c7 next, right? So Flores Rios took with the queen, then queen to e4. It's a simple thread on a8 and on e5. Rook e8 is the only move. And then after bishop to b2, basically black's position just collapses. Well, there is the direct threat of taking on e5 next. There is a pin in the e-file. And the only sort of logical way to defend this would be f6, but that loses instantly to queen takes g6, and if king f8, well, then we have bishop a3 check, and everything is gonna go wrong for black. So after the move queen e4, after move bishop b2, the only reasonable way was bishop takes b2, and after queen e8, king g7, rook e7, well, there's a threat on f7. He defended with a check, king d2, queen to c4, but after rook takes a7, it's just an extra exchange, and sort of after queen d5 check f3, if you give a check on d2, he can just go to h3, and well, Rios played on a few moves here, but white is completely winning. I think a brilliant example and a great choice by the author, both in terms of, I mean, that here in this position, we actually are allowed access into, well, his sort of brain during the game. This you can only do if you explain your own games, because everything else will be retelling someone's story or guessing, right? But here we get his own feeling. We get to understand that he thought he should just be fine, and he is not. And, well, he uses the powerful previous example to show where did So get his inspiration from. And we can see that the tactical motives in the sort of sacrificing a pawn in the C-file is even extremely similar. So I think I mean, an awesome pair of sort of instructive games by the author. Kudos for that, and I hope you enjoyed them too. I really like this example by the author. It's Hernandez against Meyer from 2013. And, well, I like it for several reasons. Well, for a start, it shows that the Grunfeld structure is not reserved only for Grunfeld players, right? We can see that there is a pawn on g7 in this position, which logically means, well, it can't be a real Grunfeld, right? So the Grunfeld structures comes from well, the scimitars nowadays, quite often the Queen's Indian, or like these games, the Queen's Gambit Declined. It's a very general structure, so it will appear from a lot of openings, but well, we call it the Grunfeld structure. This example, I think, is good because it counterbalances the previous examples. There we saw how even in simplified positions, white could develop a massive initiative due to the d-pawn. This is also a simplified position, but here white's center has absolutely no potential. And I think it's important to sort of speak of the differences with the examples we just saw. It's also a typical position in when you see black, playing this kind of solid openings like the Queen Gambit Declined, but is still trying to win. That games like this will happen where, well, black would equalize, but I would say in this position, it's not that black has equalized. Black has equalized comfortably. White is okay, but white actually has to start, finding some good defensive moves. And compared to the other games we saw, the problem for white is that his center is not very mobile. It's, well, I would argue that the pawn on c3 is somewhat backward, and there is no kind of comfortable way of pushing the pawns forward. If you remove the c-pawn, the c-file was open, rook fc1 would be great for white. Then there would be no weak pawn on c3, and, well, he could start having activity. But at the moment, there is very little white can do of positive. In the game, white tries to do something positive, and it goes very, very badly. The question is, what should you actually do? What is the objectively best move? Well, there is moves like c4. You could argue that, well, why not transform the position into hanging pawns? But, I mean, with hanging pawns, I think we remember that, well, their strength is the activity that comes with it. And here in a simplified position with only one set of minor pieces, I think the hanging pawns is more a liability than they are a strength. It's hard to see white creating any kind of attack. I think the author suggests that perhaps the most reasonable thing was just to start putting your rooks like this, but it is kind of sad, and the computer also says black is slightly better with just normal moves like this. I think the strongest plan in this position actually is the move Queen b3. We just want to take our a-pawn and try to get rid of it and exchange it like this. It's basically getting rid of some kind of weakness, and perhaps also the queen on b3 is keeping an eye on squares like c3 and a3, which we will see later has some kind of relevance. It's sad that with white you are forced to play some kind of basic defensive moves, trying to well, exchange down to only being slightly worse. But, well, that's the hand you are dealt, and that's how you should be doing it. We can see that Hernandez tries to have a much more positive outlook on the position. He plays the move e4. It looks extremely logical, right? I mean, before I was talking about this weak passive center of white. Now this, at sight, doesn't it look like everything we had before? It's easy to start, painting a positive picture that rooks will come here and then the center will start moving forward. Unfortunately, that does not reflect reality at all, but I can understand Hernandez for doing it, because what I just showed you before, the sort of objectively best moves, they all create a sad impression, and they are very much admitting that, yeah, I misplayed this position, I'm slightly worse, let me try and make a draw despite having the white pieces. So e4, I mean, it's so understandable, both from a psychological point of view and also from having the white pieces, that you will think I sort of am obliged to attack, but it's just wrong here. Knight f6 is a very nice move. Well, the idea, of course, is to put pressure on the pawn on e4 and force white to defend it. It's also that, well, should white play e5? We have seen in some positions that well, white will go e5, and while it gives black some squares, it gives white an attack. Here, however, it's just a great situation for black. You see again that having these 2 pawns on means that this weakness persists on c3. We are attacking it immediately, and I think, well, it's obvious that this knight on d5 is strong, while white having a kingside attack, well, there's just too few white pieces attacking on that side. So e5 is a bad move when black is just better due to the d5 square. Another perhaps reasonable thought would be to, why not bring the queen back to a better square? So let's say queen c2 takes rook c8, queen to e2. There is times when such a setup is good for white, but then we would normally have, let's say, a bishop on d3 and a bishop on b2 pointing sort of towards the king, and also, let's say, a bishop on b2 would protect the c3 square. Here, in this simplified version, black is again just better. I mean, there is a bunch of natural moves that comes to mind. I would say that we could play moves like rook to c3, or the author mentions queen b7, again attacking this pawn, and I think the computer is even suggesting a move like queen a3, also being typical, controlling the c1 square, so white cannot start competing for the c file immediately. And again, this center is just fragile, it's not dynamic at all. So here black is also very, very comfortable. White chooses rook f to e1, which is logical, and black now makes the exchange on d4 and go rook c8. Yeah, again, it's a matter of how should black defend in this position. Sorry, how should white defend? In the game, he goes queen a6. That doesn't really work. I think maybe queen b3 is again a kind of a nice move. Queen b7 will attack the pawn here, and I thought it was worth mentioning that after queen d3, the author mentions this nice move, queen c6. What's the point? Well, for a start, it does control the c1 square, but it also sort of insinuates idea like queen c2 or maybe even queen c4, wanting to exchange queens. Generally, well, when you're pressing for an edge, quite often you want to keep queens on, but with this structure, I think getting the queens off is quite reasonable. I mean, well, as long as black keeps the c file, his chances in the ending is great. And also with the queens off, there is a defender less of the e4 pawn. So either the rook has to keep staying on e1, or if he plays e5, we get the d5 square. This is a very, very uncomfortable position for white already. But he doesn't make it better by the move he plays in the game. There comes queen to a6, rook goes to c2. I think rook h3 happens, black doubles, rook a d1, rook to c4, and well, knight e5, rook to c7. It's actually important to understand that, well, black is considerably better here. Well, I've seen positions like this, so for me it's quite natural, but I guess for some, again, it could be deceived by, well, isn't everything in basically active positions? And also, does white have any weaknesses? Not in a sort of physical sense, right? I cannot say that this pawn or that pawn is weak. But the c file is a much more relevant file here than these two, because they're not really doing anything. I mean, these pawns are actually blocking the activity. I would argue that, well, the e4 pawn is weak because the knight is attacking it. So the question for, let's say, evaluating, is this structure a good one for white or a bad one for white, is there potential with d5? And well, as luck would have it, he plays the move d5 in this position. Actually, it would be better to play something like maybe rook e2 and try to hang in there, but I think Hernandez hasn't fully grasped yet that things are quite unpleasant for him. So he plays the move d5, but after takes, just queen c5 is a very simple counter threat. He threatens on f2, and well, next he can just safely take the pawn on d5. There's no reasonable way to defend here. I think the game was knight d3, queen takes d5, knight b4, queen c4, and well, you don't win on c2 because a6 is hanging, so they got something like this, which black won. But I think now we have basically left where the position has any kind of relevance for our structure. So let's try and sum up a little bit. As mentioned, I really like this position because, well, I think I used the term comfortable equality for black. It's almost an understatement. If I was black here, I would be very optimistic. Perhaps the reason for this optimism is that chess quite often moves in like trends, and the trend is already positive for black here. It's like black has equalized, white's opening advantage is gone. It started to become slightly better for black, and if white doesn't really sort of realize that, take some harsh decisions, and starts just trying cynically to, swap things like I suggested, let's say with queen b3 and a4, to just admit I'm slightly worse, let me really try hard to make a draw, then you can easily slip in the wrong direction. And that's exactly what happened. And I think, well, let's say even a position like this, this position, I think it's important to be able to see that, well, this center, it's not strong, it's vulnerable, and the vulnerability comes from lack of minor pieces being there, which means that a kingside attack is not going to happen. It also perhaps comes from, let's say, the queen being a little bit misplaced, but we saw even later, right, that in a position, let me say, where were we, like this, right, that even here, when it looks like white is actually quite beautifully coordinated and doesn't have any kind of weaknesses, then, well, we see the Grunfeld structure can lead to the c-file being the important one. And I think, well, this is actually a good example because both has somewhat gotten what they wanted, at least in a sort of, well, picture-like way. But here, black has something real in the c-file, while white's activity is connected with this break, but black being ready to meet that means that he's actually comfortably better. So I really hope this example helps to balance your understanding of the Grunfeld structure, that sure, d5, even in simplified positions, can be very powerful, as we have already seen, but it's also dangerous at times. So I thought a really good example. Our next game is between Parligras and Nepomniachtchi, and two quite interesting players. Nepomniachtchi now is a sort of World Championship challenger, but this game is from 2011, and at that point, Nepomniachtchi hadn't really sort of managed to fully unlock the potential of his talent. Still a very strong player at the time of the game, but not to the full extent as we know him now. Parligras is also quite a strong player, and he had an amazing event here in the 2011 European Championship, and we will see him play a beautiful attacking game and beating Nepomniachtchi here. The reason I'm smiling a bit is that, well, the 2011 European Championship became sort of known for let's say, tiebreak scandal, in the sense that the tiebreak system was kind of flawed, and that heavily sort of affected me and Parligras, who under sort of normal circumstances would have qualified for the World Cup, but we didn't because the system was kind of awkward. But we won a protest case and both got to play the World Cup, and I even played against him in the not the quarterfinals, but the third round of the World Cup in 2011, which I won. So that's a huge and great memory for me, but of absolutely no relevance for this course. So maybe I should talk about chess instead, right? Nepomniachtchi has just played the move knight to a5 in this position, and this knight is obviously aiming for the c4 square. Again, perhaps like what we saw in the Karpov-Kasparov example, my first instincts would be that black is just doing fine here, right? I mean, this square on c4 does look juicy, and well, all the black pieces seems to be playing quite well. That, however, is quite wrong. Here, I guess it's the center again, and perhaps also the pair of bishops that matters, but also that this knight on c4, it's gonna end up somewhat empty there. And well, white starts by a nice move. Well, Karpov did something similar. He puts the bishop on g5. Well, for a start, it's out of the way of this sort of annoying knight, but it creates somewhat annoying pressure. It turns the pressure in this direction. Let's say if black should go knight c4, maybe we can go queen b4 and attack these pawns. And well, suddenly white's position starts making much more sense. It's like that the knight on a5 was, targeting these two pieces, but they are not real. They are not permanent. They can just be moved away. Nepomniachtchi continues with b6, a logical move. Perhaps it renews the idea of knight c4 without queen b4 hitting b7 and e7. And the next move is really a key move for understanding these kind of structures. And I remember again in my youth, I was very puzzled with this, but also very it made a strong impression because it looks ugly. It looks like it's destroying some of white's, the beauty in the white position. Right now, we have this, beautiful looking pawn center, right? They're standing next to each other. So there is no particularly weaknesses and they can both move forward at some point. But here, it looks like harmony. But Palligras plays the move e5. And I guess at first sight, we will say, okay, what is the idea? Isn't he just weakening the d5 square? But the d5 square is of no particularly relevance right now. I mean, there is no bishop standing on b7, for instance, and, this knight has a long way to get there, and should it get there, it's honestly not doing that much. So, what's the positive sides on e5? Well, a huge part of it is that it blocks the bishop on g7. This is actually starting to become a problematic bishop, and especially in more modern games, we will see a lot of games where this bishop gets blocked on g7 totally by this pawn. So while we do give up the d5 square, we get sort of the blocking of the bishop on g7 in return. And this is actually quite a common theme in this Grunfeld structure. Well, especially when it's a real Grunfeld with a bishop to block, right? As well, the extra space we get gives options for attack on the king side, but that we will see clearly in the game as it progresses. Nepomniachtchi goes queen to d7, and Palligras plays rook fe1. I think nowadays, with AlphaZero having happened and so on, we would just play h4 and get the attack going immediately. But this is 2011. I think the world was not fully ready for just tossing h-pawns all the time. So Palligras makes a common sense move first. Knight goes to c4, queen e2, e6. And now comes h4. It's basically, it's an unstoppable kingside attack. There's no way you can hold it in any kind of reasonable way. I mean, well, what is the threat? We are just going to play h5 and make it uncomfortable on the king side. In theory, we could perhaps transfer our queen somewhere here and start playing on the dark square. This certainly happens, but well, we will see also quite often that the pawn will go to h6 and the bishop on g7 will be basically dead on d8 at times. But generally, it just creates a lot of tensions and sort of probe for weaknesses on the king side, and it's extremely difficult to do anything reasonable against. Nepomniachtchi chooses to play h6 here. I think Krasenkov has given notes to this game somewhere. The author quotes him, and he suggests maybe b5 was a better idea. And then he goes on with h5, knight b6, h6, bishop h8. Here we see the sort of really clear concept, right? That basically these two pawns is going to block the bishop on h8 forever. You could even, well, I'm just going to make random moves, but let's imagine something like this. Here, After the move f4, you can make the case for that this bishop is just, it's never gonna get into play. The rest of the board is doing quite well for black, actually. Now, I mean, the kingside attack is gone. But white will just go rook c1, start exchanging pieces, and then basically, well, black is playing without an extra piece on h8. Well, anyway, the example, he goes queen d2, rook c4, queen f4, knight d5 is the game in the book. And then after he takes with the pawn, sort of to be able to meet, let's say, bishop f6 with something like, I don't know, queen e6. But, and he says this is perhaps not too bad, but this is a 2011 understanding of chess. If you turn on a modern engine, it says something like, let's say, a3, a5. It goes rook d3, b4. It goes rook f3, just to sort of protect the f6 square for liberating the bishop. And after queen e6, rook c1. The engine says more than +2 in this position. It's actually a massive evaluation, but it's basically this bad bishop, this strong pawn, and this is part of the AlphaZero influence. And, well, I think we will see it in the next game. It becomes more AlphaZero style against the Grunfeld, but it's a very important theme to grasp, that this position is much more horrible than it looks. It might even look balanced with sort of black having the queen side and white having the king side, but it's not at all. It's really bad. Anyway, that was a slight detour. After h4, Nepomniachtchi chose to play h6, kicking the bishop back. It goes to c1, and now he plays b5. You could also consider a move like h5 here, mentions the author, but white just starts opening files with g4, and after takes, well, he doesn't even take back on g4 immediately. He wants to go bishop to e4. Next is gonna happen queen takes g4 and h5, and basically now, I mean, when we undermine this one, the h7 pawn is gone. We are basically gonna get to the h7 square immediately with a queen or bishop. And white is going to have an amazing attack. So this is kind of the problem, that we attack with h4, but they typically can't go h5, because then we get the option of opening the position like this. So Nepomniachtchi played the b5, h5, and then g5 being his idea. He's trying to keep the king side closed, but the problem is now that there is a weakness on the king side, and that is basically that the h7 square is close to being undefendable. There's no black piece that can reasonably defend it. So white can just regroup with the move bishop to e4. It's also extremely typical. It's well, it's looking in this direction, but in reality it wants to go here, and then it's the queen who has to go there. So well, I think, yeah, maybe the best move would be something like a6, but after queen e4, bishop b1, there is starting to become a threat like this, and well, the author says now you have to play f5, but of course white will take en passant, and well, white is just being better here in a positional sense. He suggests the move a4, which looks reasonable. There is still, of course, also this route here, although it's not really being made. But white is better here. I think he has advantages basically on the queen side, the king side, and in the center, and he has good pieces. But black is doing his best to really hold on. Nepomniachtchi obviously wasn't thrilled with that, so he plays the move knight to b6. And then Parligras, he doesn't go back to b1. He actually stops on d3 instead, just to sort of, well, win a bit of time by threatening this pawn first. And queen e4 is still coming next. You can't take on d4, obviously, because of, well, bishop h7 check, picking up the queen. So this is a very sad position. The logical move perhaps is keeping the pawn with b4, right? But after queen e4, it's generally a hopeless situation. Sometimes you can just run away with the king like this. I remember having a training session, well, one of the first training sessions I had with Vishy Anand when I became his second. I was also at some point very excited getting to give a check on h7, but he says, after king f8, sometimes the position is just completely safe. The problem is this is not one of them. And you can just take on g5, and when they take back h6, it's basically horrible. This is going to be mate if you go to f8, and if you take here, well, then we give a check, and well, now obviously we have gotten to his king, and we are pawn up here. So this is pretty horrible. So after bishop d3, there is not much to do. Maybe actually a nice detail, but we are getting into chess rather than structure now, is that after f5, you take it, you give a check, and then d5 is a very nice move, because bishop b2 is going to come next, and that's also going to spell disaster. But I think now we are basically having fun with the misery of black's position. So let's return to bishop d3. I think game was knight d5. He took the pawn, and after this he's just a healthy pawn up, and the bishop can return to d3 and he's better. So I think enough about this game. But I think a great game for understanding this position. Here, I mean, at first sight, as I mentioned, it's not clear to me who is having a good version here. Is it black who is sort of well timed with counterplay, or is white actually having some kind of chances on the king side and the center? Well, the game paints this very clear picture of that it's white who has potential here. And first the move bishop g5, and then especially e5, I think is incredibly useful. That this is a double-edged structure. I mean, when you make a commitment by playing a move like e5, you have to understand that it's risky what you're doing. But it's also important to understand that sometimes it's really good. And I think this game is a great example of that. And from here, it's really just downhill for black. But of course, maybe this move h4 also deserves mention, because it's integral in breaking down a black structure. And we basically saw that whatever black does, white is going to get to his king, and that the black counterplay is seriously insufficient here. So an amazing game by Parligras here, and well, amazing game in itself, but also showing a lot of important themes in this Grünfeld center structure. Our last game in this Grünfeld chapter is Vovk against Volokitin. It's a game from 2012, the Ukrainian championship held in Kiev. It's an interesting game, but let me just start it a little bit earlier than in the book to tell a personal story, because this is a very typical position in the sort of main line of the Grünfeld. And in 2010, I was Vishny Anand's second during the World Championship match against Topalov, and Topalov would always play this system against the Grünfeld. So we basically had half of a year to come up with a great system for black against this Grünfeld. And trust me, we worked really hard on that. But despite of half a years of work, Vichy managed to lose the game in less than 2 hours. It's basically amazing, right? It's the best player in the world. He's 4 seconds. We put in so much energy on this position, and we still managed to create this one of the most disastrous games in World Championship history. These things happened, and of course there was some kind of misremembering of opening prep, but it was typical, you know, we were not fully happy with things, then there is last minute changes, and then something goes wrong. Anyway, that was a slight detour. In that game, Topalov played the move queen to d2, and after e5, bishop to h6, and he started attacking heavily against the black king. Quite successfully. It was also actually interesting that while black's position was okay, modern computers says that white was winning earlier. And that's perhaps also a good reminder that even, you know, the best analysts, the best players, they will still be somewhat slaves to the current situation of Indians. And we will always think that Indians are telling the truth. Well, I actually think they are telling the truth right now, because we have gotten to the stage in chess evolution where Indians has become absurdly strong. But it wasn't the case in 2010, and we were still basically following them blindly. So maybe they're also wrong now, but I don't think so, but it could be. Just a thought. Anyway, in this game, they play rook c1, which is a kind of normal move. And here, Volokitin plays the move e6, which is quite reasonable. At that time, a somewhat rare move, but perfectly playable. Perhaps for understanding, it's worth mentioning that, sure, white can win a pawn, but it's a sort of trademark of the Grunfeld structure that, let's say, after queen c7 takes, black typically has a great compensation. I mean, white's extra pawn is this weakness here, and well, we have control of the c5 square. There is perhaps an option of, let's say, e5, bishop e6, or knight b7 to c5, depending on circumstances. The specific doesn't matter too much. It's generally considered a normal feature of the Grunfeld structure that white taking an extra pawn like this is not particularly promising. So after e6, the game was queen to d2, bishop to b7. Now he goes bishop g5, which was very normal at that time. Again, AlphaZero and Leela has changed our perception of such position. Now the computers just say you should go h4, and that is basically a great move. Well, you can't take it because then bishop g5 basically traps the queen. I mean, the very basic line being something like this, with the queen being gone, right? But I mean, of course, the idea of h4 is to push it in this direction, and this turns out to be quite promising. But while we would see h4 happening, I mean, even before AlphaZero and Leela, I think we hadn't fully grasped how to do it and how quickly we could do it. And h4 here is a good example of that. Wolf plays the move bishop to g5, and now Volokitin plays queen d6. That's also quite interesting for me, because, well, he's trying to induce the move e5. But as we saw before with Parligras, this can actually be quite a strong move. And I really think it is here. But the author calls it more double-edged, but that's the typical pre-AlphaZero, pre-Leela understanding of chess. Objectively, it would be better to play the cautious move queen d7, not to give him a tempo playing e5. But Volokitin plays queen d6, and it turns out great for him. So e5 happens, and then queen to d7. Now the game goes queen e3. Not necessarily a bad move, but I mean, for sort of a modern perspective, the position screams to have h4 played. Sorry, h4 here. So the rook, the book gives rook f to c8, h5, takes, and it just starts exchanging pieces like this. Now if rook c8, the book mentions takes, bishop f6, and somehow the king starts feeling uncomfortable. This is correct, and this is quite typical even of today's examples. But in this position, he suggests the move knight to c6. A very logical move, attacking the d4 pawn before white gets to put up his sort of attack in full strength. And it should be noted that if white plays h6, well, we can go this way, and somehow our bishop doesn't get stuck at h8. So things sounds pretty great for black, you can argue. And well, the book goes on to discuss bishop b1. But the modern understanding of this is the move bishop b5, which computers now says is just close to crushing. And the basic idea is that we just gotta remove this knight on c6. Sure, our bishop on d3 is the, in principle, good bishop, but, well, we don't care about these long-term things. We care about the attack on the black king. And after, let's say, a6, okay, that's perhaps a friendly move, but illustrative. We're gonna take and go bishop f6. And, well, we are basically, we want to exchange on g7, we want to play h6, and there's going to be massive weaknesses on the dark squares around the king. I understand that this knight right now is perhaps not doing much, but it protects the d4 pawn, and it means our queen can perhaps go to g5. We can also see our rook is, well, it has a threat on c6, and while it's perhaps not very relevant, having the c file is. And it also means the queen has to keep this bishop protected, which perhaps means it gets more difficult defending the dark squares around the king's side. And also, this knight on e2, you can easily be regrouped to, let's say, f4 or g3, attacking the black king. So this position is not just sort of, balance. No, it's more than +1 for white. It's a huge attack simply with the black king being so weak. And it's probably also an example of black having no very obvious weaknesses. Sure, b6 is weak, but it can be put on b5. All the black pieces are generally on healthy squares, but the dark squared color complex around the king is a weakness. So actually in this position, the black king is a serious weakness, and white is just much, much better here. And this is sort of the modern understanding of this Greenfield structure, which meant that, black has started to play things a little bit different. For instance, we saw the knight being on a5 in the beginning of the game, but nowadays they would probably keep it on c6 to have more pressure on the center. Anyway, that was a considerable detour, but h4 I moved to really know that this is extremely topical and quite strong in these structures. Wolf plays the move queen e3, and now knight to g3. So he's sort of keeping his h pawn at bay. This, of course, is logical. It's aiming at these two squares, but this is kind of too slow. Black swaps rooks, and then knight c6, attacking this weakness on d4. And now, well, it's not so simple for white to defend it, right? And of course, you can go knight e2, but that's not what you want, obviously. And I think in this position, maybe you should try bishop b5 as well, actually. He goes bishop e4 with a similar intent, perhaps to take on c6, but on a, at least optically looking better square. But after rook c8, h4, knight b4, it becomes very sort of uncomfortable for white. Basically, the attack is not really in time, and we are starting to, there will be a swap on d5, and the knight will not necessarily grab the pawn on a2, but go to d5 and attack the queen and defend the f6 square at the same time. The author basically gives the idea that black is better here, but modern computers doesn't seem to think so, just giving an idea of that while this h-pawn attack certainly not is in the best shape, it's still enough for equality here, the computer thinks. So the game was takes, bishop f6, takes on e4, you swap here, you take on e4, knight to d5, and now perhaps the last step in the wrong direction for white. The book mentions that queen d2 is a better move, and it very much is, because after queen c4, h5, there is still sufficient counter threats. I mean, putting the pawn on h6 can be very annoying for the lone king, that it becomes very vulnerable. So the book suggests to play, let's say, h6, but after something like takes g3, black still has nice queenside play, but there is some weakness on the king side, which means that white should be able to draw the game, the computer thinks, which seems very, very reasonable. The game, he chooses to go knight to d6 instead. And, black is happy to exchange queens, but somewhat on his terms. If you take on e3 and the knight takes on c, I mean, you can see that if you do like this, somehow this knight is not immediately hitting a black target, while this knight was helped to do something useful, right? So black quite cleverly plays the move queen to c3. And, white now exchanges it. But this the author says this is a very typical Greenfield dream in a way, that we actually get an equal ending now. You can see that white is threatening these two pawns, and black is threatening this pawn and also this pawn, sort of via a check. But this doesn't mean it's just equal. On the contrary, black plays this nice move a5, and after knight b6, knight takes a2, black has a considerable advantage. Simply, the a pawn is a passed pawn, and it's gonna be very uncomfortable for white to stop it. It's not an unstoppable passed pawn. It's not like it wins immediately. But you can see in the game goes king f1, knight c3, knight c4, a4, knight a3. So he managed to stop it. But then black starts playing on the other side. He wants to play king h5, and after, let's say, g3, we're going to go even further to g4 perhaps. Or, if he puts pawn on g3 and f3, maybe we can play something like g5 opening files. It's very, very unpleasant. White plays the logical move g4, but then king g7 is strong, and after king e1, h5 is brilliant. Basically now, there is no reasonable way for white to defend. Let's say if he goes g5, then we have this basically knight tour like this, and we're gonna win the h4 pawn, and then we're gonna get another sort of passed pawn on the flank. And well, should white in the meantime spend all his energy getting this pawn, we're gonna get so much progress on this side that we're gonna win there. And if you take like this, then you can see that basically the king will enter like this. So I think in the game he basically played the move king d2, and then a nice little twist, typical tactical trick, g5, and well, if you take here, then h4, and the pawn will start running. And well, yeah, this was the game. I think king e1 like this, and now here you just go knight d5, you collect this one, and then you take the rest, and with an easy win. Anyway, this was a slight detour in the end, perhaps, but I think, well, it's also important to sort of explain that black, of course, has strategic potential in the Grunfeld center. We saw one earlier game where black won sort of in a middle game, but here we get a more pure form that the ending is actually quite good. And well, of course, in the ending, well, it's black who gets a passed pawn, right? I think the middle game was also interesting, but the book is giving it from this sort of pre-neural network understanding of things. And I thought it was important to add moves like h4 to explain that nowadays you attack like this directly, and perhaps also I thought quite important to get this bishop b5 idea that you are simply willing to give your powerful bishop away because your kingside attack is that strong. So I hope this was I mean, a good balanced example to round things off with, that we see how black has the long-term perspective, but we also got to see the sort of modern ideas in this bishop c4 Grunfeld. So I hope you enjoyed that.